They were number one in the nation when they arrived, and they were not when they left. And that was an extraordinary game, and I'm looking forward to hopefully continuing the streak today with enormous Texas hospitality, but also putting up the W at the end of the game. College sports is something amazing. It's something that brings all of us together at a time when so many other issues divide us. There's so much partisan disagreement across the country. We're yelling at each other on so many issues, and yet on Saturday afternoon, on Sunday, we can come together and we can cheer for our teams, we can cheer for whatever sport it is. And it's something that is also an amazing avenue for opportunity for thousands upon thousands of young men and young women to get an excellent education. And I got to say right now, the state of college sports is the Wild West. It is chaos. And there is growing realization across party lines that Congress needs to act. We need to step in and act to preserve college sports. And so I've worked very closely with A&M and with universities throughout Texas and multiple conferences and the NCAA, working initially just to solicit best ideas in terms of how to address this issue. I've now filed legislation. The legislation that I've filed, number one, protects college athletes' rights to name, image, and likeness. I think it's right, I think it's fair that if a young man, a young woman develops an incredible skill, they become incredibly good at a sport, and they're able to generate millions of dollars for their school, that they're entitled to earn the fruits of their labor. They're entitled to share in that reward. So I think that's a good improvement for college sports. But at the same time, we need a way to have some system of rules so that you ensure competition, so that you ensure that you don't have a handful of giant rich schools scooping up all the best athletes and you destroy competitiveness throughout the league. And so my legislation also empowers the NCAA to set rules governing recruiting and pay to play, to make sure that you have fairness across the system. My legislation also makes clear that student athletes are not employees. There's ongoing legislation right now to treat student athletes as employees. I think that would be a terrible outcome for college sports. And I think one of the objectives we want to have here is not just ensure competitiveness across sports, but we want to focus beyond the Power Five and football and basketball. We want to protect smaller schools. We want to protect non-revenue sports, because thousands and thousands of young men and young women are getting an opportunity to get a great education, which they wouldn't have without an athletic scholarship. And so we need to make sure that any approach that comes in doesn't destroy non-revenue sports, doesn't harm smaller schools, and ensures that we have real competition. All right, with that, let's open up to questions.
What makes you feel like your legislation or any legislation at this point will be able to make it out of committee, because it hasn't yet?
So listen, it's a good question. The Committee of Jurisdiction is the Senate Commerce Committee. And I'm the ranking member on the Senate Commerce Committee, which means I'm the senior Republican on the Senate Commerce Committee. The Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over about 40% of the U.S. economy, including all issues concerning sports. My hope is that this bill will bring together bipartisan agreement, and it's an open question. I don't know if this bill will pass or not. In drafting it, what I've tried to do is listen to the stakeholders. We spent months sitting down with the stakeholders and trying to get ideas from everyone impacted from it. I can tell you, we've seen incredible support from the schools in Texas, from multiple conferences, for the bill I've introduced. A big question is going to be, can we get Democrats and Republicans to come together? And that's an open question right now. One of the divides, so there's multiple pieces of legislation that's been filed. One of the divides is who should have the power to set the rules. Some of the other bills create a new governmental agency or quasi-governmental agency and put the government in charge of college sports. I think that's the wrong approach. My bill instead uses the NCAA. Does the NCAA have its problems? Absolutely. But I think it's a heck of a lot better to have a member-driven organization that reflects the interest of multiple stakeholders in college sports, rather than a government agency in Washington that would be unaccountable. And I got to say, God help us if we have politicians debating what's pass interference and what's not. That is not the job of politicians. We ought to leave college sports to those who do it and know it and are focused on it. And my hope is that we will see Republicans and Democrats willing to come together. That doesn't always happen in Washington. There are a lot of issues in which Republicans and Democrats are at each other's throats. I hope when it comes to college sports, there is a wide recognition that Congress needs to act. And the question is, will you see senators on both sides being willing to give, being willing to compromise, being willing to find common ground to get this done and to save college sports for the years going forward?
Is there any receptiveness, or has there been any receptiveness to this idea, or are there a lot of members of Congress that would just like to do nothing? I mean, I know you've got your legislation in. Ross, you've talked to a lot of them. What is your gut feeling about this moving forward?
So I have to say I have not heard any senators arguing for doing nothing. So in terms of what the right approach is, if someone believes that, they're staying really quiet. There are complicated issues to navigate. I can tell you I've had good and productive conversations with Maria Cantwell. She is the chairman of the Commerce Committee, and she's a Democrat. We haven't agreed on the entirety of the bill, but we've had very positive discussions. My team and her team are talking on a daily basis. I'm also having conversations with other Democrats engaged in the process. And the question is going to be, can we come together? Look, among Democrats, there are some that are proposing solutions that would result in college athletic programs getting sued like crazy and every college athlete becoming a union member. I think neither of those would be good outcomes for college sports. They wouldn't be good for athletic programs, and they wouldn't be good for students. You know, if a student athlete is an employee, there are a whole bunch of things that go with that. Employees can get fired. You know, you have a receiver who drops 3 passes and suddenly you're fired and your scholarship is gone. That is not a good outcome, and there are not a lot of student athletes that would be happy with that. If you're an employee, you've got wage and hour and overtime restrictions. The first time a coach has 2-a-days, and you get in there and say, nope, sorry, you got to be time and a half. You can't do this anymore. Look, I never got to play at the college level, but when I was in high school, I can't imagine my coach's expression at coming in and saying we're going to punch a time card. I think that's really antithetical to what college sports is all about. And one of the things to remember, look, fewer than 1% of college athletes are going to go on to the pros. So it's easy to focus on the big marquee name that's generating millions of dollars and that is a TV star. And there'll be people that go on to the NFL or the NBA and make a bunch of money. But 99% of college athletes, that's not going to be what they do for a living. That's not going to be how they pay their mortgage. But the skills they learn, the discipline they learn, the teamwork, the ability to win graciously and to lose and take it and be a good sport, all of those are skills that can transform a young man or young woman's life. And for a lot of these kids, without the chance of an athletic scholarship, they would never have a chance to get a college education. And so I think it is really important that we preserve that for the full breadth of the kids. And my hope is that we'll see Democrats and Republicans being willing to work to common ground. We're not there yet, but I've got optimism on it.
Senator Cruz, I think it was about 3 weeks ago that you put it about 60-40 that Congress will be able to pass something. What we've seen happen since there, especially in the House, is those still kind of the same odds. It's gotten worse. You know? So
I would still put it about 60-40. Listen, the House, you've got chaos right now in leadership elections. That'll get resolved. I think we'll get a Speaker of the House next week, and they'll work through this. If we pass this legislation, I think the legislation is going to come from the Senate. It's going to come from the Senate Commerce Committee. And I will say the Senate Commerce Committee has a long tradition of passing bipartisan legislation, working together on pro-jobs, pro-competition legislation and passing it into law. I've authored 94 different pieces of legislation that have become law. And so I believe this is an area, there are some issues that are just partisan and you're going to have D's and R's fighting. I don't think this issue has to be one of them. And so my hope is that we will have senators on both sides who are at their college games this weekend, who are cheering on their teams, and they don't want to see their teams and their schools, they don't want to see the programs go away. They don't want to see non-revenue sports dry up. They don't want to see, you know, you look at a different sport, you look at basketball, March Madness. I mean, one of the great things is you got 64 teams and any one of them can win the whole tournament. That competitiveness is an amazing thing. And at a time when There's so many things that divide us. I hope we can preserve sports that brings us together.
There's, in several of the bills, there's portions that are healthcare initiatives. I know, I'm not sure that's part of yours, but what was some of the feedback and why you didn't have that in there?
So look, I fully expect healthcare to be an element of what's discussed and in the bipartisan negotiation. I think it depends on the circumstances. For a Division I school, a big program that's generating millions of dollars, that's one thing, and you've already got the provision for that in those circumstances. For smaller schools, if you've got a Division II or Division III school, if you've got a sport that's not generating money, imposing a healthcare mandate could end up just eliminating those programs. And I don't think we want to see these kids having their athletic programs taken away because a bunch of politicians in Washington drove up the cost. And so I expect that to be a topic where there's some compromise. And if we start with the premise that we want to ensure kids are getting a good experience and protect their opportunity to go to school, we ought to be able to find a middle ground.
How do you envision and maybe Ross, this may be a better question for you, but in terms of maybe donors laundering to play through NIL to say, here's just, sign this napkin, I'll give you 6 figures as like an NIL. How do you kind of envision a system working out to where you're not restricting and you're not getting into the business of, fair market evaluation, but you're also kind of, I guess, putting some guardrails on that?
So look, what this bill tries to do, and I think if we're going to get a bill that passes, you can't try to address and solve every problem. What this bill tries to do is set up a framework to empower the NCAA to address those issues. We want to have fairness that applies across the board, and transparency. So one of the elements of this bill is transparency on reporting for a school what NIL rates are paying, so that a kid, you have a 17, 18, 19-year-old kid who has no idea what the market will bear, what is a fair market price. There's a real potential for those kids to get taken advantage of. Another element of my bill is a provision for registering of agents, because if you suddenly again have 17 and 18-year-old kids making millions of dollars, you have a real potential for unscrupulous players to come take advantage of those kids. And so having a process to register agents where they're working on behalf of their clients and not trying to take advantage of them, I think that's an improvement that can benefit the system. Ross, did you have thoughts?
No, that's exactly right. And that's the thing. So we're playing Alabama today. Alabama has no state law around NIL. Texas has a very robust state law around NIL that allows the universities to be involved. So that's why we need a uniform standard, so there can be a central repository, there can be a database, there can be clarity around, here's the structure, and everybody plays by the same rules. That's what we have to get to.
And I will say one interesting thing about the Texas legislation. So the state legislature passed NIL legislation, and it put explicitly in the bill a call on Congress that the state of Texas wants Congress to legislate, that there needs to be a federal solution for this. I don't know that I've ever seen a state law ask Congress to get into the issue, but you don't want to have a situation where you got 50 states all fighting with each other in the state legislatures for their schools to have an advantage over other schools. That doesn't make sense if you want real competition across the country, and that's why I think there's a need for Congress to act, and I hope my colleagues agree. All right. Go ahead.
You mentioned not being able to fit everything into one bill. When you're speaking to stakeholders beforehand, particularly Everett Plains, what were the keys that they wanted to be covered as soon as possible, and how did you try and address that?
Look, there are a variety of interests and approaches. What we tried to do, we started with protecting the NIL rights of the athletes, which I think it's a much more fair system. If you have a young athlete who's developed amazing skills and skills that can produce enormous sums of money, it's not fair for that athlete not to be rewarded handsomely. Particularly, you're a star quarterback, you've got millions of dollars in your future, and then one linebacker hits you on the side of the knee, that whole thing can go up in a flash. And so the risk to the athletes wasn't fair. And so I think protecting their right to earn the fruits of their labor is a very common sense approach, but ensuring that it happens in a context that also preserves the competitiveness of college sports, I think that's the right balance. And it's going to have to be a trade-off between the stakeholders. And if the NCAA has this authority, they'll be making that trade-off as well. And they'll be listening to competing claims and having to balance them to protect everyone involved. All right, thank you guys.
That's a wrap.